The autumn air hung thick and humid over Oviedo, Florida, on that October evening when 17-year-old Tyler Hadley made a decision that would shatter two families forever. In the quiet suburban neighborhood where manicured lawns stretched endlessly under streetlights, the Hadley family home at 410, Grandview Drive appeared no different from any other. Behind its beige stucco walls and terracotta roof, however, a storm had been brewing for months. Tyler had always been the kind of teenager who lived in the spaces between expectation and reality. His parents, Blake and Mary Jo Hadley, were devout churchgoers who believed in structure, discipline, and the power of prayer to guide their son toward righteousness. But Tyler moved through their carefully constructed world like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit, his dark eyes holding secrets that would have terrified them had they known. The evening began like countless others. Blake, a square-jawed man in his 40s who worked in construction, sat in his recliner watching the local news. Mary Jo, petite and soft-spoken, moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing dinner while humming hymns under her breath. Tyler retreated to his room, ostensibly to work on homework, but instead stared at the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead, its rhythmic whirring the only sound punctuating the silence of his racing thoughts. What happened next would forever remain locked in the darkest corners of Tyler's mind, emerging only in fragmented confessions that painted a picture too horrifying for most to fully comprehend. The official reports would later state that the first gunshot rang out at approximately 8:47 p.m. Blake Hadley, still seated in his chair, never saw it coming. The second shot followed minutes later, finding Mary Jo as she stood frozen in the hallway, her hand clutched to her chest in disbelief. In the immediate aftermath, as silence reclaimed the house save for the continued drone of the television news anchor discussing weekend weather, Tyler stood motionless in the living room. The weight of what he had done seemed to press down upon him like a physical force, yet his actions that followed suggested not panic, but a peculiar, calculated calm that would later disturb investigators and psychologists alike. Rather than flee, rather than call for help, rather than do any of the things one might expect from a teenager who had just committed an unthinkable act, Tyler methodically moved through the house. He turned off lights. He locked doors. He gathered his parents' bodies and positioned them with an almost ritualistic precision that spoke to a mind operating on a logic incomprehensible to the outside world. Then, in what would become the most chilling aspect of an already horrifying case, Tyler drove to the First Baptist Church of Oviedo. The Gothic Revival building, with its soaring steeple piercing the night sky, had been a sanctuary for the Hadley family for years. It was here that Tyler had been baptized as a child, here that his parents had celebrated their wedding anniversary just months before, here that they had prayed together every Sunday for their son's salvation. At 11:23 p.m., Tyler dialed 911 from the church steps. The recording of that call would haunt everyone who heard it. His voice, eerily steady and devoid of emotion, requested not an ambulance or police, but prayers. "I need someone to pray for me," he told the confused dispatcher. "I've done something terrible, and I think God might be the only one who can help me now." The dispatcher, trained to handle emergencies but not theological crises, pressed Tyler for details. Where was he? Was anyone hurt? Did he need medical assistance? But Tyler's responses meandered between confession and deflection, between lucidity and what seemed like dissociation from reality. He spoke of his parents in the past tense, mentioned feeling empty inside, and repeatedly asked if the dispatcher believed in redemption for those who had committed unforgivable sins. As police units were dispatched to both the church and the Hadley residence, the full scope of the horror began to unfold. Officers arriving at Grandview Drive found the front door locked and the house eerily quiet. When they forced entry, the scene that greeted them would later require psychological counseling for several of the responding officers. The bodies of Blake and Mary Jo Hadley lay in their bedroom, positioned almost ceremoniously, with religious artifacts placed around them in a pattern that suggested their son had been attempting some form of twisted memorial service. Meanwhile, at the church, Tyler had ended the 911 call and was found sitting in the front pew, his head bowed as if in prayer. When officers approached him, he looked up with eyes that seemed to hold no recognition of the gravity of his situation. "Are you here to pray with me?" he asked, his voice carrying the same unsettling calm that had characterized his emergency call. The investigation that followed would reveal a young man who had been struggling with depression, substance abuse, and what psychologists would later term a complete disconnection from empathy and consequences. Friends would describe Tyler as increasingly isolated in the months leading up to the murders, speaking often of feeling trapped in his parents' expectations and harboring resentments that had festered in silence. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came from Tyler's own journals, discovered hidden in his bedroom. Page after page detailed elaborate fantasies about death, freedom, and what he termed the ultimate escape. He had been planning the murders for weeks, viewing them not as acts of violence against the people who loved him, but as necessary steps towards some twisted form of liberation. The trial that followed captivated the nation, not only for its shocking nature but for the questions it raised about the intersection of faith, mental illness, and evil. Tyler's defense team painted a picture of a troubled teenager whose mental health had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer distinguish between right and wrong. The prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation and a calculated coldness that suggested Tyler knew exactly what he was doing when he pulled the trigger. Perhaps most haunting of all were the testimonies of the Hadley family's fellow parishioners, who spoke of Blake and Mary Jo as devoted parents who had done everything they could to guide their son toward a righteous path. They had prayed for him, supported him through his struggles, and never given up hope that love and faith could overcome whatever darkness had taken hold of their child. In the end, Tyler Hadley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in shackles, he turned back toward the courtroom gallery where members of his extended family sat weeping. For the first time since that October night, his mask of indifference seemed to slip, and observers would later swear they saw something that might have been remorse flicker across his features before disappearing forever. The First Baptist Church of Oviedo still stands today, its steeple continuing to reach toward heaven in a neighborhood where the Hadley family home remains empty, too haunted by memory for any new family to call it home. And somewhere in the Florida correctional system, Tyler Hadley continues to serve his sentence, though whether he ever found the redemption he sought in those desperate prayers on the church steps remains a question that only God can answer.